welcome you all to this roundtable, national roundtable on the CARICOM Commission Report on marijuana, originally published in 2018. The reason for this is very simple. We, as part of the non-state actors and the Conference of Churches of Grenada, recognize that groups such as ours have a responsibility to take part in the shaping of public opinion. And when the government called indirectly some weeks ago for discussions on these matters, we saw it as an excellent opportunity to try to push things forward. Because on such an important matter as this, every voice must be heard and every viewpoint respected, even as we seek to determine what is in the best interest of all Grenada. And now I want to introduce to you the chairman of the Conference of Churches Grenada, Reverend Silbert Prescott, who will make some welcome remarks.
Thank you, Bishop Harvey. Honorable Minister of Agriculture, the Honorable Peter David, Professor Rosemary Antoine, Chair of the CARICOM Commission on Marijuana, members of the various panels, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen present here in this hall, as well as those joining us via social media, good morning to one and all. Over the past few months, a number of issues have featured prominently in the national, regional, and global arena. They include the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, the transfer of power in the US, and many other issues. However, beneath the surface of these issues is the simmering subject surrounding the use of marijuana. Of course, the pros and cons surrounding marijuana is not new. It is not a new discussion. As far back as the 1960s and early 70s, amidst overwhelming scientific evidence which attests to the medical properties contained in marijuana, led to a number of people in various countries, including the US and many US countries in Europe, to advocate for reform of laws regarding the use of marijuana. The discussion around the subject ranges from decriminalization of the substance to legalization for medical and recreational use. Here in the Caribbean, many of us would recall reggae singer Bob Marley making the link between marijuana and the leaf of the tree, which Revelation purports will bring healing to the nation. Peter Tosh, also back in the 1970s with his hit song, Legalize It, gave voice to the growing call for changes to the legal regimes regarding marijuana. The call was given for the impetus in the Caribbean when in March 2014, the Caribbean Heads of Government meeting held in St. Vincent established a commission to explore the possibilities for reform in marijuana laws. This has since then put the issue on the front burner of the discussion in the islands of the Caribbean region. As a responsible social partner, the Conference of Churches, in conjunction with the Interagency Group of Developing Organizations, are committed to facilitating and providing a platform for debate on issues of natural importance. And it is in this regard we came together to organize this roundtable to reflect on issues recorded in the Commission on Marijuana, which we referred to earlier. This is to provide an opportunity for individuals and groups to reflect and to contribute to the national debate from an informed position. And hence, I want to extend a warm invitation or welcome to all of us who have gathered here and elsewhere to join in this debate as we lay the groundwork and begin the discussion here in Grenada. I trust that we will have a wonderful and stimulating day of discussions, and I pray that most of us will leave this place and wherever we are gathered on the various social media platforms as more informed persons ready to engage in the debate surrounding this subject.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce a man who needs no introduction in terms of Grenada, but those of you who will be listening to this overseas, the Honorable Peter David has been Minister, I was going to say Minister of everything at one time or another, but he is now Minister of Agriculture. And as Minister of Agriculture, he has with the Attorney General, a lot of responsibility for areas which have to do with what we're discussing today. I really want to thank him in advance for being here, and we look forward to his opening remarks. Minister David.
Thank you, Bishop Harvey. Good morning, everyone in the room, everyone on Zoom. And thank you for inviting me here. I want to first of all thank the organizers, the IAGDO, the Interagency Group of Developmental Organizations, and the Conference of Churches. I want to thank Bishop Harvey and my dear Reverend here for the participation and the work you're doing in this regard. And on behalf of the government, say to you that the job you're doing assists us tremendously with respect to the consultation that we refer to. I also want to thank CARICOM for yet another excellent example of what we can do together as a region. There are persons who sometimes lament the shortcomings of CARICOM. I want to praise CARICOM for this initiative in bringing the region together on such an important issue, and to thank the Commission itself and all of the commissioners for the excellent work they've done. I want to thank Chairperson, Professor Rosemary Belle Antoine, for her excellent chairmanship or chairpersonship of this very important commission, and to thank the Commission for an excellent report. I think the report, from my reading of the report truly reflected, and this sometimes doesn't happen, truly reflected the region, the position of the people in the region, and what the roadmap should be going forward. And the recommendations, an excellent working document as a basis for the way forward for Caribbean governments and Caribbean peoples. When I read the report myself, there are things in the report that I felt, but the report gave me the basis, the empirical basis on which to support the position that I instinctively held. I, apart from being Minister of Agriculture, which my dear brother Harvey indicated, which gives me certain responsibilities, I spent more than 20 years practicing criminal law, solely criminal law in Grenada, and more than 10 years practicing criminal law in New York. So I came face to face with the negative effects of what the Commission itself calls a legal regime characterized by draconian criminal penalties. And I agree with the conclusion that the laws, as I saw them, were ineffective, discriminatory, deeply unjust, unfit for purpose, violative of rights, and lacking legitimacy. I agree when the Commission came to that conclusion, a conclusion that I think reflects most and the overwhelming majority of people and the governments in the Caribbean. I look forward to a discussion today on these, and that would certainly assist the government in drafting its own position. I was very pleased also when the Commission report concludes that the overwhelming majority of people in the region support change of the status quo. In fact, I was pleasantly surprised some years ago when I was speaking to a pollster in the region who indicated to me that even in Grenada there was overwhelming support, because quietly, you felt that the loud voices in opposition reflected the true position. I am surprised, and the fact that the Conference of Churches is here this morning hosting this activity is an indication of where we are as a people on this very important subject. And the truth is, the numbers are growing in terms of the numbers of persons who are supporting change of the status quo. In Grenada, we have a similar shift in a direction of support for change. And that is reflected by none other than our Prime Minister, the Honorable Right Honorable Keith Mitchell, who several years ago, and he admits this, we're not saying anything that he doesn't say, who admits that he had opposed change to the status quo some years ago. And to his credit, he has accepted that he has changed his views and now supports change of the status quo. And I think in his comments, he mostly speaks to the impact it has, and I think we all can agree on this, the impact that the criminalization of small amounts of cannabis and cannabis in general has had on our youth. Experiences that I have had in courts. I have had young people for me to represent them in courts with small amounts of cannabis. They are university students who are facing expulsion because of criminal record, who cannot get a visa to travel to a country where they want to go study, be it Canada, the US, or other countries, because they have a criminal record. In fact, when the government, a few years ago, and I was in the Senate at the time, and piloted the Rehabilitation of Offenders Bill, it was an attempt to remove records of young people who found themselves in this position. So the Prime Minister speaks a lot about that, and that is a major issue confronting us here today. The issue of hundreds, if not, in Grenada, and thousands throughout the region who have criminal records for small amounts of cannabis. Not only records, but talking about imprisonment. Talking about the amount of monies that we spend on law enforcement, rather than other issues that are much more in need of that expenditure in the Caribbean. In all of the comments, though, the Prime Minister has indicated that one must not ignore, and the report also speaks to this, one must not ignore the potential negative consequences of going in a particular direction, in particular, the issue of young people and the age range that would be allowed or should be allowed use of cannabis, in addition to the question of driving while under the influence, an issue raised by the Commission. And I look forward to the comments on that, because while we move forward, and I think there is a general consensus that we have to effect change, we must also do the change in a way that does not have negative consequences for our young people, for our society in general. So those are some of the challenges that we face. And while final determination of all, the government at this time, let me say this, the government at this time, and the Prime Minister has indicated, and the government has indicated, the government of Grenada accepts the report, and the government will move forward to effect changes. We will do consultations, this included as one of them. At the same time, we do believe that there is a general consensus, so we can move quickly on some aspects of it that I will outline in a minute. So the government has already drafted some legislation. That legislation will be submitted to the Parliament and allowed for discussion for some time, and certainly the Conference of Churches, the IAGDO, and all these organizations will have an opportunity to comment. But I do hope it is not one of these consultations that go on for years and years, and the problem remains for years and years, because I think, based on all that the Commission has said and based on all that has happened in the region, that we do already have a consensus on certain aspects of this that we can move forward with while we await a consensus and a decision on some of the more difficult parts. So I look forward to that. So while there has not been a final determination, we are already on course to make some changes. For example, I think there's a consensus that we must decriminalize certain amounts. We've seen it happen in nearly all of the Caribbean islands, where ranging from 15 grams to 28 grams has been allowed for personal use in the home. So there is a certain level of consensus on that, and I am sure that we can move forward on that. The question of cultivation of a small amount. Some people say 3 trees, 5 trees, 7 trees. Certainly an amount in the quiet of your home can be grown by users. So I think there is a consensus. Some countries say 5 trees, some countries say 3, some countries say possession of 28 grams, some say 15 grams in a region. But I think it's a question of how many, not whether or not we make those changes. So that is there. And the use by the Rastafarian community for their sacramental purposes. So I think there is a consensus on those 3 things: the Rastafarians and the use of it as a sacrament, the cultivation of small amounts, and decriminalization. With respect to the larger issues, and certainly as Minister of Agriculture, I would close on that. The larger issue of cultivation for medicinal purposes and for possibilities of economic benefits to the country, I want to commend the report too for spending some time on that. Because I think as a society we have to take control of that and ensure that we use it in a way that benefits our society and benefits our farmers. We need to have much more discussion on that, and that may take a little longer time. So in the medium and long term, the issue of medical marijuana and the issue of cultivation may take a little more time, but we have to begin that process of discussion today. So there's a short run, the medium, and the long run. As Minister of Agriculture, I look forward to that. I look forward to us going in that direction. I know I will conclude in a minute, but to say this, as a parent and a grandparent, I am absolutely elated to have lived long enough to see this day come when we are discussing this issue. As the report says, the current position is obsolete, and deeply unjust. With all of the available evidence of the history, one of the things I want to say to the Commissioner and Bishop is that I was always curious in the court as to why this thing was illegal. I mean, there are some trees growing and it becomes illegal, and I was happy to read the history to show that it was in the 1930s or early 20th century when this thing became illegal for reasons other than it being a dangerous drug. And I am happy that our society, and I urge everyone to read the report. Sometimes we have opinions that can be changed by seeking knowledge. The report has all the information. Cannabis can no longer, in my view, be accurately described as a dangerous drug with no medicinal and other value. It has value. We may agree that there are some possible negative consequences of overuse, youth use, but I think the report clearly establishes that it has other values, including medicinal value. I used to say in the courthouse over and over that I'm sure we will move to decriminalization and legalization when the big countries do it. Unfortunately, we are here now. They have done it and they are taking the market. We have to run from behind. Unfortunately, the region is running a little from behind because we didn't move as quickly as we should have. In closing, I want to quote the Commission on the way forward. Just to quote, the end goal should be the dismantling of prohibition in its totality, to be replaced by a strictly regulated framework akin to that of alcohol and tobacco, which are harmful substances that are not legalized. However, the Commission went on to say, it is recognized that law reform can take many forms and should conform to national realities. Meaning that while we move forward as a region, the Commission recognized that each country will do it according to its specific conditions and the state of consciousness of the people with respect to that. Again, I want to say that the government of Grenada will soon be bringing legislation before the people, will soon be bringing legislation before the stakeholders, so that hopefully we can confront this issue. I thank you, and I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Now, it is my absolute privilege to introduce somebody who's coming to us by Zoom. She is the chair of the CARICOM Regional Commission on Marijuana, currently one of the most powerful women in terms of influence in the region, Dean of the Faculty of Law at University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and an award-winning author, attorney, activist, and international legal consultant. She's won many international awards and honors for her scholarship, which has been described by international jurists as original, insightful, and amazing. Professor Rosemary Belle Antoine, who will speak to the report itself and introduce the report to us.
Thank you so much. It's my absolute pleasure to be here, and good morning everyone. All of you are very distinguished people there and very holy people too. I am happy to pleased to be able to do it. As you know, it's unusual circumstances. Certainly a very important topic, and I'm so happy that Grenada is now on board. What I've heard from the Honorable Minister. As you know, the commission was created by CARICOM. What's important to note is that it was a multidisciplinary team. So we had medical doctors, we had scientists who had been working on cannabis for many years at Mona. We had social workers, we had a youth representative. We even had a pastor, so we had the religious side represented. And it took us a while. Initially, we had some funding issues, but it wasn't our problem, of course, but CARICOM had to, we didn't get the funding at first to do the consultations, because it was always the idea that we had to listen to the people, apart from our own research and so on, and that entailed going all over the Caribbean, holding public consultations, and also smaller stakeholder meetings. A very, very, me personally, very enriching and rewarding experience. I learned so much from my fellow CARICOM citizens. Sometimes very moving, I must say. And as has already been said, even from that time to now, we can see that the growing consensus towards reform in terms of the law on marijuana. Let me just say that we'll call the Marijuana Commission, but we recognize that marijuana itself has a negative connotation. So this is why we use marijuana stroke cannabis in the report, and I probably will use cannabis in my presentation. For me personally, and we all started off quite neutral, but I certainly for many years had been probably on the other side, doing work in terms of anti-drug, so on and so on. But at the end of that whole process, it was very clear to me, and my own personal commitment is that there must be not just law reform, but perhaps in the longer term, depending on how countries, some need to creep, some need to jump, that it must be not just decriminalized, but it should be legalized, and we will explain as we go along. And that is very much my own firm conviction today. So we have reimagined the issue, and as was said, the vast majority of people we spoke to across the region, and also we did some polling, is that the people of the Caribbean want the law to change. Not always for the same reasons, but social injustice is a huge issue in the whole discussion. But I want to say up front that the medical marijuana had not been as large in terms of our discussions when we started, but of course now it has become even more important. So there are some people, I guess, who are more interested in the sort of the profit that can give. But when we wrote this report, and still now, the social justice issues to me still remain at the forefront. So there's overwhelming support, at least for decriminalization. So I cannot say with any accuracy that everybody wanted legalize it, as Peter Tosh said. But certainly, as a baseline, most people say at least decriminalize. People should not be in jails if they use cannabis, at the very least. And many, many prominent persons and groups have lent their voices to discourse of all walks of life, including church leaders, and you will recall our own former Archbishop of Trinidad and Tobago talking about this as well. And we've had magistrate judges, DPP members of parliament, many people who have said no, at least decriminalization. Minister, yes, when we did some polling, 2018, in Grenada it was 61% who said that it should change. And I suspect if we did polling today, it would be probably in the 80s or the 90s. I always recall when we did the consultation in Barbados, because we did most of the countries. As you know, we did not get the opportunity to do Grenada, so I'm happy there's been a change of mind. But when we went to Barbados, to a packed audience, I always recall a group of persons, elderly persons, many of them, with disabilities in wheelchairs. They begged the commission to change the law for them to access medical marijuana. So, and in the consultations as well, we've heard all the stories of trauma, especially from the Rastafarian movement, and who have, of course, suffered a lot because of the draconian laws in terms of cannabis. So, as was just said, we believe the draconian legal regime is ineffective. It is indeed discriminatory, unjust. It doesn't at all respect the rights of citizens and lack legitimacy. And this whole what we call prohibition, and you recall we had prohibition of alcohol not so long ago, is also preventing us from taking advantage of whatever economic opportunities that may exist in the cannabis industry. And more importantly, something that we often overlook, in the current regime, once it's illegal, you can't legitimately do research on cannabis. So this has been a hindrance in terms of its scientists even moving forward the agenda in terms of cannabis. And of course, prohibiting persons in terms of the medical effects, which I think today nobody disputes. Prohibiting citizens access to medicines that can heal them, not just more effectively, but more cheaply than traditional pharmaceuticals. And so we understand, I think, that this is not good law, it is ineffective. The law must have a purpose, it must be there to correct a wrong society. And I certainly believe, and we all believe, that the regime right now offends the rule of law because it never had a rational basis for criminalizing it. And law should have a basis, to correct a harm or mischief. But when you have laws that what really is the mischief that is designed to correct, then it is time to change. So the legal history, and the minister mentioned that he got some justification reading about it. Marijuana, of course, has been used, cannabis has been used for thousands of years, and so much misunderstanding about it. We remember, many of us can remember our grandparents using cannabis. It used before decriminalization, which really is not that old. It was in the 1930s, and before that changed. Using it, the East Indians, for instance, coming from the fields, is part of their culture. In fact, I suspect ganja comes from Ganges. That is my own sort of theory. To relax and whatever, without any sort of persecutions. It was only about 100 years ago that it became illegal, and of course once it became illegal, stigmatized and so on. We used to use it for bush tea, etc., etc. And the deep historical, cultural and religious significance to Caribbean peoples cannot be ignored. So several ethnic groups, Asia, Africa, Middle East, and even the Chinese, know it as having healing properties, which is what the Rastafarians have told us for a very long time. And well, I always like to mention that every time we had consultations, the Rastafarian community, who really, they have kept the light burning. They have been the ones lobbying over the years when I guess other people gave up their own deep religious sacramental meaning for that community, and they've often quoted for us from the Bible. You know, the every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things, Genesis 9:3, and many other passages in the Bible that they used to say that this is a sacred plant that we have now criminalized. And of course, perhaps we don't know this, but in the 60s and so when we began, and a bit later also, the Caribbean was one of the first to start patenting medical products. Dr. West from Mona, who you created Canasol for the treatment of glaucoma for the eyes. So the notion that cannabis or marijuana is a dangerous drug without any value really had never had any valid basis for it. And yet it led to international treaties and all over the world these laws which has caused so much harm, harsh criminal penalties in all forms, usually within a context of strict liability, meaning that you have no discretion once you're caught with a couple ounces. You know, the judge has no discretion but to jail you and so on. And the scandal is that this designation of being a dangerous drug, scheduled as a dangerous drug and in treaties and so on, had no scientific or medical data at all to support this classification. And clearly now we know a misleading status. There's been one very, very important development very recently. Last month, in fact, WHO finally has declared that it should be reclassified, so it's no longer as a dangerous drug, and that has been a lot of hard work went into that, international lobbying to get that. So we still wait for these treaties to be abandoned, but it's very important that the WHO has said there's no basis for cannabis to be treated as a dangerous drug. It is not a dangerous drug. So we've already made a huge step in that regard. And really what we can call a legal fiction, the laws. And it is very significant given the harshness of the law, which was premised on the supposed harm of it. So we created a criminal law that downpressed thousands of people without any evidence that it was harmful. But what is more egregious, and I think even more sinister, is that there's enough evidence from that it wasn't just an accident, that this regime, this draconian prohibition regime came about. It was a deliberate move by, particularly in the US and so, the Schaefer Commission and the Nixon and so, that it was done deliberately to shift and to stifle competition with alcohol. And so that whole history is very sordid, and we've had this bad reputation. Laws are very powerful. Once you create something, make it illegal, it can do a lot of harm in terms of connotations and so on. And just as long ago when alcohol was under prohibition, it was seen as something almost sinful. But once the illegal regime was lifted, it is now seen as socially acceptable and morally acceptable, although we know that alcohol is dangerous. So it's the same thing that happened with cannabis. So the issues then for us are questions of social justice, the efficacy of law enforcement, whether in fact having these draconian laws served any purpose at all, even in terms of prohibiting human rights, of course, and the moral basis of the law. And we believe that cannabis should be taken out of the criminal justice system altogether, should not be viewed towards through a narrow criminal law lens, and certainly has failed. The criminal law has certainly failed. So now the Commission envisaged it and envisages it going forward as a public health issue and also a human rights issue. And that is how we would like to frame it. So in the context of the right to health, And of course, in terms of the human rights, protection against discrimination, and also your right to health. But certainly, public health will always be there because we do know that although it may not be harmful in the way we consider it before, it is psychoactive. So um, the enthusiasm on the ground sort of support that we have seen and is growing, and the notion that more and more persons are accepting the social justice issues, I still believe should be the priority. I am a bit concerned, quite frankly, about the embrace of CARICOM in a couple of years since the report was launched in terms of the medical cannabis industry, perhaps with less emphasis on the social injustice issues that really I think are the priority. I'm not saying that we should not, of course, move towards medical cannabis. Sure, we can, but we should not neglect the deeper issues, which really is the fuel for our report and our findings. And when we investigated all of the evidence, scientific, medical, legal, social data, and so on, it was clear that the public opinion demonstrates that the existing prohibitionist regime induces more harm than any possible adverse consequences of cannabis. And in fact, in many ways, the horse has already bolted because it was very clear that despite all of these draconian laws in place, Caribbean nationals, including children, are already accessing marijuana. And this is the finding all over the world, by the way. There's a very high percentage of people all over the world who use cannabis despite prohibitionist laws. We've met people who describe themselves as medical refugees in terms of being able to access cannabis from other countries and not being harassed. Again, to emphasize that despite the medical marijuana issues, the social justice ones are ones I really would like Grenada to get it right in terms of that. So, again, the penalties in terms of cannabis, it really is quite incongruous and again unjust. Grenada is my mother's home country, so I had to do this for Grenada. Yes, so we are all agreed that the status quo needs to be changed. We have to accept that cannabis is a substance with psychoactive properties. There is potential for negative health consequences, just as there's potential for alcohol, for tobacco, and so on. We do believe that there are mental health complications for the youth in particular, but the risks, when you look at them, are quite specific and I dare say minimal in terms of the overall risks. But in terms of youth, we were very clear that that was something that we needed to pay more attention to, and there needed to be more research because we had conflicting reports about effects on youth. So we took a conservative approach, in that regard. But even if, I like to talk about, when you're growing up, your parents said, don't drink coffee to make your head hard. I think it is quite clear that until you become an adult, your brain doesn't really react to any of these substances in the way that adults should. So we do believe that there is caution, there should be great caution. I am aware that some of our colleagues, I know some Rastafarians, for example, said they give their children the ganja tea, and there's been no effect. And the jury is still out, but we took a conservative approach. And as I said, with many other substances, alcohol, coffee, all of these, there's enough evidence that young people should not be using these. So, in the same way, and that is what I mean about the public health issues in relation to this. There were some myths that were abounding, and even up till a couple of years ago, I was at a judiciary conference, and judges were saying to me, "But doesn't marijuana cause you to engage in criminal behavior?" The answer is no. What causes and these are some of the myths that we talk about, but the scientific evidence has now disproved. If anything, is the opposite. Cannabis causes you to chill, to sort of but I don't know another word that say chill, but essentially it placates you. It doesn't rile you up the way alcohol does. Where the criminal aspect comes into it is because of the draconian laws that we have created. It is because of that prohibitionist regime that creates the gangs and the whatnot, not the substance itself. And also the myths in terms of, cannabis being a gateway drug. There's enough evidence now from the science that that is not so, meaning that if you start off with cannabis, you're going to graduate to cocaine and so, which are harmful and not at all natural substances, of course. So we have, there's the science is disproving that these are myths. And incidentally, my deputy chair, Professor Belle, who's a psychiatrist in Mona, after, or actually just when we were about to launch a report, because of course, Jamaica went first with the decriminalization. He had been doing studies in that time in relation to his mental patients, and he was able to report that indeed there was no sort of effect. His results are very positive in relation to that as well. Also, the addiction issues like addiction and psychosis. And we heard a lot of in every session we had one or two persons who would say, but I have seen where young people took marijuana and they ended up mad, as the case may be. And that may be so. But what the science is saying that, well, one, as I mentioned, young people should not be taking it. And two, we also learned, and the evidence shows that often they combine cannabis, whether it is alcohol or whether it is substance, and that itself. So those are the kinds of things in terms of disproving the myth. But clearly, the scientific evidence now establishes that cannabis is less harmful, or at least no more harmful, than substances that are already prohibited or criminalized under law, like alcohol. So we don't throw you in jail when you take a drink. Although alcohol, lethal rate is 50 for alcohol, 100 for cocaine, and 0 for cannabis in terms of how lethal it is. So really, something is wrong with that picture. So we can regulate, but why do we need to put people in jail? And really, it's also one of those drugs that it's a victimless drug. So when you take it, if something happens to you, it's you and you alone. Whereas we know alcohol and these others, get you agitated and so on. So the most significant is the persuasive evidence that exists for the negative effects on the adolescent brain and on driving. And of course, as you know, and as was said, our recommendation say not at all, at least up to 21, we would not recommend it, except of course medical treatment and so, because we do know there are issues with epilepsy with treatments. So we did find on the balance that the proven medical benefits outweighed the risks, and that is consistent with other bodies, other commissions, UN Commission on Drug Policy, and so on. In fact, they labeled the current legal regime as redundant, and the scientific data supports it. So a controlled regulatory environment. And one of the reasons why, apart from not being quite sure the impact on the brain for young people, is also because marijuana, cannabis, it demotivates you. And I don't think we want our children, when they are supposed to be learning in school and so on, to be demotivated. And that's the same chill thing, you feel irie and all of that. So this is another reason why we would not want young people to use it, and children. So a public health rights-based non-prohibitionist approach. And we also, in terms of the criminal classification, clearly it is flawed, and now that the WHO is agreeing, there can be no argument again about that. It's dangerous drug and so on. And we found too that they were ineffective, and estimated 183 million people use cannabis all over the world. I must say I was quite surprised how many children we met, and because we had special sessions with the children who admitted that they used marijuana. It was very easy to get access to it, so we are fooling ourselves if we think that these laws that we have in place is preventing anybody from using it. So on that basis alone, I think is grounds for change. So really it is counterproductive. And we found in our consultations right across rich, poor, black, white, all social classes, professions, race, religion, stood up and said, "Well, I use cannabis." Of course, it was very frank discussions. Nobody would get arrested saying it then. So people were very frank with us, and this is what our polls also showed us. So it really is a remnant, the whole prohibitionist legal regime, of what we now know is a discredited war on drugs approach, which has failed. It hasn't deterred usage. It has created probably gangs. It has created more inequities in our criminal justice system, and there's enough already. And we know too that even when you get to jail, quite ironically, access to marijuana is sometimes even more. Company told us that. So the important thing about the criminal justice system too is the harshness of it. Apart from the fact that you can be jailed easily, if you do get fined or if there are bail requirements, it's usually the poor that get arrested and you can't pay the fines. So everybody ends up in jail. We had instances in Guyana where 80-something-year-olds were sent to jail. We had one in Trinidad. An elderly lady too was using the cannabis for her pain, and and that's all that helped her. And of course, she was also incarcerated. So the propensity to incarcerate people, the warehousing phenomenon, led to and leads to a wasteful and very costly system where many potentially productive lives and families have been destroyed without any benefit to society. And there's some gender dimensions in there because the mothers are imprisoned. We heard very heartrending stories, where the families takes care of them. And even lawyer. Oh, I forgot to say I had an assistant police commissioner from Jamaica on my commission as well, and he was very pro to legalize. He said after all these years he's seen the damage, and many law enforcement personnel, surprisingly perhaps for some, complained that this was a very ineffective, wasteful system, and they felt that their resources were better employed fighting serious crime. And we did some questionnaires with the police as well, and that was the result. So the police are just doing their job. And in fact, if the laws are there and they can make the arrest, they will do it. But many of them agree that this should not be. And they also said to us that they do not believe that cannabis is a causative factor in criminal conduct. They said usually in their experience, cannabis persons use it for stress relief to calm things down. And I think that was a very important sort of idea coming out of all our research and so on. But of course, they talked about the turf and the gang wars, leading to the violence, etc. What we have noticed too is the tendency now to hype up the cannabis, to mix it with other things, other artificial products, to raise the THC levels, which is the one that causes the high. And that too is because of the illegal sort of regime, and it gets more expensive, and its whole vicious cycle. Very important for me personally, and I think for many of us, is that this law is very discriminatory. In every session, I ask the police, why is it? Because people complain to us, and I think people know this. Why is it that you tend to target certain people to arrest for cannabis? Usually, as Gypsy would say, the little black boy. So there's already the poor and the marginalized who get arrested for cannabis. And you know what they told us? But it's easier. It's easier to do it that way, and they're aware of it. So they will be landing on the block, etc. And I guess they don't have a fancy lawyer too. But we know that marijuana is used as a glamour drug. You see it on television, Hollywood. The upper middle classes use it in their private parties. They are not arrested. So what we have done is to create a law that disproportionately impacts the poorest persons, and of course those are the persons who cannot afford the bail and the etc. and the etc. And don't get me started on remand. People stay for long periods on remand. In fact, one of the reasons that the remand situation was dealt with and tried to deal with in Jamaica was when a young boy, 15 years old, Mariano, was arrested for a spliff, small amount of marijuana, ended up dead in the jails. And that caused them to try to change the remand system because, as you know, when you're arrested and you go on remand, you stay long periods and other injustice. So it's a law that is also subject to abuse because of this inequity, and it is unenforceable. Clearly has been unenforceable. It's inappropriate and irrelevant. And the penalties, it is really ludicrous that you can be arrested for intent to do bodily harm, which is a very serious criminal offense, and you another person can be arrested in most of our laws because we ramped up our laws 1.5 grams of marijuana, and it could attract up to 40 years in jail for the marijuana, whereas the person who almost killed you could get a non-custodial sentence. In fact, Trinidad and Tobago, when they increased the penalties for cannabis some time ago, it was challenged. The judges pronounced that it was unconstitutional, the penalties and so on. But they still, at the time, there wasn't a discretion. They would take the discretion. This is the kind of inequity even within the criminal penalties we have. So when you compare what happens in terms of other serious offenses and what happens when you get arrested for cannabis, it really is unacceptable. And as I mentioned before, often there is no choice to judges. And sometimes the judges say this, they say, with a heavy heart, I have to sentence you, etc., etc. So the law is definitely too harsh and turns a blind eye to other offenses. So really we need to change it. We've had many instances of over sentencing in relation to these laws. So the disproportionality, the inconsistency, the injustice, all of these issues come to bear, even though it's a victimless crime and a travesty in the justice system. All of this leads us to think it undermines the legitimacy of the law and inhibits its enforcement. As one person told us, a plant is not a criminal. Yeah. The social and the legal dimensions also in terms of the human rights issues. What we have also, of course, with the stereotyping and the prejudices, I mentioned the Rastafarians. They have had a really rough time. I know in Antigua they gave an apology, etc. And there's talk about reparations because they were really persecuted in relation to cannabis. The drug itself and drug use itself, we know from our studies, is often a function of poverty and lack of opportunities as a coping mechanism, for instance. So what we're doing is a legal system that penalizes and criminalizes persons who are already vulnerable. And these are already very broad social issues, not solved by criminalization. You don't solve that by throwing people in jail. And this is why I say I support medical marijuana, yes, but we cannot forget these very important social issues. I should also tell you that there's been a lot of jurisprudence in the last few years, which also started with Canada and the US, the case of Allard and so on, which have also led to conclusions that there are human rights in terms of health. In Canada, for example, Allard, where a person who was a cancer patient was growing a plant in order to make tea to treat his cancer. He won his case on the right to health, to be able to treat oneself, health. So little by little, we're getting cases coming forward which are saying to us that it cannot stand the prohibition. In our own neck of the woods, since the report was used in the McCoffey case, my colleague Judge Ventos used the report to to rule in favor of the unconstitutionality in St. Kitts as well, one of the cases involving. On the same thing with being using it for medical treatment and so on. So the legal the jurisprudence and the human rights issues are also telling us that this regime, this legal regime, cannot stand for long, and more cases are coming before the courts, challenging the rights of persons to self-medicate, etc. And of course, we always have the right, freedom of religion, in terms of the Rastafarian community is always there, as well as one of the human rights. In the Barry Francis case that I mentioned, when the Trinidad changed the penalty to 40 years imprisonment, what the court said it was arbitrary, capricious, oppressive. The sentencing formula was cruel and inhumane punishment, excessive and wholly disproportionate to the offense. That was the court in terms of that. We are learning lessons from those who have gone before. Jamaica, Uruguay was one of the first to move in the direction of legalizing, and what we are seeing. So we are seeing, therefore, that since Jamaica in 2015 decriminalized, the latest polling revealed that, as I said, first of all, no discernible change in psychosis. In other words, it's a myth that if you were to legalize and decriminalize tomorrow, then everybody begins smoking marijuana and all sorts of things happen. There's a little bump, yes, people are curious, but it levels off, and there was certainly no increase in psychosis or mental health issues. And what we see too in Jamaica, it went up to 90% approval of legal reform. So once it started, even those who were sort of opposing were on board, saying this was the best thing that could be done. So that's very important, to learn the lessons from others. But it's not just about human rights and public health. Because this is an illegal substance, the whole cannabis issue gets entangled in the money laundering aspects of our law, because once you get profit from by unlawful means, it can be treated as money laundering, and that is part of the problem. So those of us who want to go into medical cannabis, for instance, you would still need to consider these issues, that if the substance itself is illegal, it is treated as the proceeds of crime. And the important impact of that, which Jamaica is facing, and Canada fortunately has its own Canadian banks. In California, for example, they weren't able to bank, although they had allowed marijuana, they weren't able, in some of these cases, to put the money in the banks, because the banks cannot accept proceeds of crime. So these are some of the complex issues where you have still have the substance as illegal. So decriminalization is one thing, but the broader brush has to be to make it legal. And it's not just about human rights and social justice, it's also about these sort of hardcore financial black and white issues. So even if you wanted to have a cottage industry, or if you wanted to go all the way medical cannabis, you have to consider that if it is from an illegal substance, still it is the proceeds of crime, it's money laundering, etc. So we have to change the legal status. So international law challenges, I don't say too much about that again, because I think what we need to do, all of us together, Minister, all CARICOM has to really get together, and we can be a powerful lobby group. I was in Vienna, I think it was last year, on the 3rd, to try to get the treaties changed itself. So WHO's statement and position is a great help, but those treaties still need to be changed. And I think CARICOM can have a powerful voice. We have a lot of international groups saying this system is redundant and so, but we still have the treaties there. So I had asked for a more formal regional position. We've tended to go unilaterally, like Jamaica tried to speak to the UN, didn't get very far on her own. But I think CARICOM needs to join with like-minded states. Canada, there are quite a few now. Canada is a big one for us because of the closeness with Canada, who of course they legalized just when we were finalizing the report. So they are now fully. So we need to join up with these countries in order to get these conventions changed so that it can be a smooth transition. Strong positions of solidarity, um, economic benefits. I don't want to say too much about that. We do have in the report, we did commission an economist to give a synopsis and a study on it, a separate piece of work. And overall, what he concludes is that you'll have more economic benefits with legalization as opposed to decriminalization. I think that's probably fairly obvious because of some of the reasons I just said there. But also, in terms of the medical cannabis industry, we do know it's a huge billion-dollar industry. We do know that the Caribbean is a force to reckon with in terms of a lot of focus on us, especially from the Canadian firms. And clearly there are benefits, but I see also that we need to be cautious because what would be really devastating, I think, for Caribbean people is if we repeat the mistakes of the past. In other words, if we sell out like what we have done with bananas, sugar, and so on, where we become, just providing the raw material and then we get very little in the end. That's a danger right now. We formed a new group, a few of us, trying to lobby CARICOM to ensure that the small farmers, the traditional farmers, are not left behind in terms of this almost like a revolution now with the medical cannabis, because we're talking about big, big business. So it's the same sorts of things we've seen in the past, and we could end up with that, and it is a great worry for those of us. Certainly for me, it was mentioned in the report, but exactly what we were warning about, we are seeing happening already. There are lots of issues in Jamaica where the farmers and those who were in what they will consider the struggle for years are being marginalized, left behind. Certainly in St. Vincent, which was our first consultation, that was one of the first issues that came up. The growers told us that they were concerned about, they were afraid of. And if you think about issues like land, all of these issues have to be thought about. How are you going to get the land? Because right now, what happened in the past, if you were growing cannabis, you would do it in the hills on state land. It wasn't your land. But once you begin to regularize and license and so on, then how does the small farmer get land legitimately in order to transform these marijuana farmers who were once considered criminals into respected entrepreneurs and farmers? So you need to help with land. St. Vincent is doing some really good work in that respect. Your co-minister of agriculture, minister, former student of mine, by the way, they have given, I think, 250 acres to the traditional farmers to help them and so on. So they are going big with the medical cannabis industry, and licensing, of course, needs to be equitable. So it's not just simply a question of legalizing or decriminalizing and saying giving licenses. There must be equity in the whole system. I know there are lots of issues with licensing in Jamaica that only certain, the big ups, the normal thing. But we met in many young people, for instance, who want to be farmers, and incidentally, I myself didn't even know that cannabis as a plant, the effects and so on, is not just in of itself. I met a very interesting woman farmer in Dominica who was talking about the ways in which the crop can be used to improve other crops. Really, this plant has really wonderful properties. So there's a lot to do in agriculture as well, not just in of itself, but and the spin-offs and so on. So there's a lot of scope for entrepreneurship and niche markets and so forth. And of course, we have the hemp industry as well. We do need to develop the Caribbean medical research industry, and that can only happen if again it's legalized. Right now, because nobody has legalized right out, straight out, but has decriminalized. even UE has been saying some of those who are doing the research is saying it's actually been made more difficult because of all the restrictions, and so that you have to have security, you have to do this. So that is something that is also we're trying to look at in terms of how do you go forward in terms of having an industry. These are the sort of nitty-gritty issues that we need to do. But I do think we need to protect our hegemony. I think we have to ensure that people are not left behind and not just sell out to the big, large foreign companies. I mean, I have no problem with them, but that we don't end up with another travesty on our hands. So it's a sort of conundrum that while it was fully illegal, persons could have a fairly good livelihood. But once we begin to license and regulate, we run the danger that liberalization and so on might disempower and impoverish them. So these are the sort of issues. In terms of the political leadership, I do hope that these lessons that we know of persistent poverty that we learned in terms of sugar, bananas, and so on, that CARICOM considers these in terms of the roadmap going forward. So the end goal for CARICOM should be the dismantling of prohibition in its totality, replacing it with a strictly regulated framework, similar to what we have for alcohol and tobacco, which are also harmful substances that are not criminalized. We should not maintain the status quo, but we do recognize that perhaps not all countries in the region are quite at that stage, which is why we said, we understand that there could be different approaches, but at the bottom line, minimal decriminalization, not putting people in jail. There are many ways you can approach it, but that's the bottom line. I don't know who will be first with the full legalization, but I am pretty certain it will come probably very soon. Responsible controlled regime, education, very, very important, because we don't want when you change law, people to feel well it's a free up, especially the young people. We need to do a lot of work with the young people. As I told you, I met many young people and they are already using, and we don't want to create a glamour industry. But certainly that sort of regulation, who sells, how they sell, etc. And never forgetting, apart from the public health rationales, the human rights, social justice, and developmental perspectives, and of course the equity issues that I mentioned. We felt that at least for now, cannabis should be banned from all public spaces, but there should be special provisions for the Rastafarian community. There are different models, and I know in Netherlands and these places you have these cafes, etc. But certainly that can be worked out with the Rastafarian community. But we felt that it should not just simply and of course we have done this already. We've already done this with tobacco. When I was growing up, you could smoke anywhere, but now you can't just pull out your cigarette and smoke. So it's doable. But again, the education, and of course, the modality thus far that is seemingly favored is to allow persons a certain amount, small amount, and also a certain amount of plants to grow for themselves. And as I mentioned, we already have precedent from the courts that it is unconstitutional to prevent persons from growing it to self-medicate. So that's already there, so limited. And we also feel that public-private partnerships would be important, especially in terms of the cottage industry. So in conclusion, we have found in the Commission that there are deep rationales for law reform of what is a harmful, ineffective, and unjust prohibitionist legal regime that currently informs cannabis. Our findings are supported by strong public opinion, by credible scientific and empirical data analysis, and we feel that this gives enough legitimacy or justification for new laws, for a new framework, public health rights focus, which CARICOM heads of governments themselves embraced in 2002, even before the Commission. So the time is ripe. We want impactful dynamic law reform. We want to consider our position as in terms of sustainable development goals, which we have embraced. And we consider again that social justice is a priority. We do not want to feel that the medical cannabis industry overtakes and we forget the warehousing and all of these people who are still being sent in jails and so on. So essentially, that's it in terms of what I'd like to say this morning. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Minister David wants to ask a question.
The governments who have passed legislation, and we are considering to say that you can have 28 grams, 15 grams, and allow a couple of trees, some cases 3, some cases 4. What is the anticipation, what is the experience of where they are expected to get these ounces from? Unless it is anticipated that everybody who smokes is going to grow, then it must be purchased somewhere. So somebody will anticipate that market and set up a business. Entrepreneurial spirit is what we encourage. So what is the anticipated response to that? The person who says, okay, I want to buy an ounce, so I have to go somewhere to buy the ounce. I'm not interested in growing 5 trees. I don't want any marijuana trees in my yard or in my house, but I want to smoke. What is the expectation of those governments who have done that, and what has the experience so far for them in terms of the supply to the small smoker?
That is actually one of the hanging questions in sort of the gray areas because, for example, Trinidad, you can have the 30 grams and so, but because we have not as yet established a law as to who can grow, who can sell, and so on. The law is silent. It turns a blind eye. So really and truly, it means that you will still be getting it from a so-called illegal source. Mm-hmm. But at this point in time, unless you have both sides to the equation dealing with the supply, then that is exactly what had happened. Of course, in Jamaica, it's different because they already established laws to, as to how to supply. You get a license, etc., etc. So I think, although we recognize that that is a deficiency, that you say nothing about where to get it, because of the urgency of this, and people still getting arrested every day. I think it is best to go. Why I say this is it's not as simple to create those laws for industry. It's not as simple. You could create the laws for industry at the same time, understanding that you will have to make amendments, and the law is very fluid in all of these countries that have done this. Jamaica, even Antigua had to do some changes and so forth. You could do that, recognizing and telling your population is not a perfect solution yet, but the simpler way really is to just simply do the decriminalization bit so that people can get relief. And that will really be the social justice issue there, that you want to prevent people from because the police will do their jobs. You cannot tell the police do not arrest somebody if the law book says that you're committing an offense. Yeah. And actually that happened in St. Vincent because I had warned my colleagues in St. Vincent. They went the other way to create the medical without decriminalizing. Mm-hmm. And they said, oh, there's going to be an amnesty. We told all the police not to arrest. Well, first of all, that is wrong. You cannot tell the police not to arrest. That's against the rule of law. But not only that, as predicted, some police decided to arrest somebody. I think there was a political overtone. So that is not a good solution. So it is better to have, first of all, if you're not quite ready with the industry bit and the licensing bit, which is not simple, let me warn you. If you're not ready with that, to at least give people some relief for the small amounts.
Chair, thank you very much for a splendid report and for your presentation this morning. My question rides on that of the just concluded question by the Minister. Given the dynamic that we are seeing playing out and some of the challenges that might be posed by decriminalization and the policing infrastructure around it, how would you, rather, we'd like to hear your comments on that approach, the decriminalization versus legalization at this point.
But I must give a disclaimer, this is my personal opinion. And in the commission, the majority of us were in favor of legalization, but it was not unanimous. But unanimously, we agreed to decriminalization. There were still one or two people, I think probably two people, who felt, we're not ready for it. And actually, the reasons were because they felt people will overdo it, sort of thing. Not because they weren't convinced about the arguments, but they just felt, we're not ready, sort of thing. But the majority of us, including my colleague, Assistant Commissioner of Police, including the pastor, interesting enough, and certainly me. So my own personal opinion, I believe we should just legalize it. But as I would always say, not just, legalization does not mean liberalization necessarily. And again, we have the examples of alcohol and tobacco. They are legal, but they are regulated. So I would not say unregulated, but I would say legalized, but within a regulated framework.
Professor Antoine, Professor Rosemary Belle Antoine, I cannot thank you enough for what you have contributed. You've been absolutely magnificent.